Something interesting about discussions of Fooly Cooly on AnyTube is the high number of creators who use and refer to the dub. Some of the most viewed videos on the topic, from Glass Reflection, Mother's Basement, Hiding in Public, Aki Dearest, Captain Christian, Giguk, all use and refer to clips of the English dub for comment and analysis. Now, this isn't really a bad thing, considering the dub's general high level of quality and the level of consultation and effort that went into the localization, as Cartoon Cypher outlines in their video Why the Fooly Cooly Dub is So Important, which is ironically one of the few videos to extensively use the Japanese dub in the video itself. But this underlines a very common thread about analysis of Fooly Cooly on YouTube, whether it's an analysis of its themes and content to its release and subsequent cult status. They're approached with a very Western lens. Again, nothing inherently wrong with this, and the anime is well known and regarded for being very unorthodox and unapologetically open-ended as an anime, although sometimes in a problematic manner. Director of the original series, Tsurumaki Kazuya, stated that this was very much intentional. It looks hip because ordinary anime has certain rules that they all follow. However, I made Fooly Cooly so that it doesn't follow that tradition. But he's also stated his continuous surprise that this and some of his other works, such as, whatever that one's called. But he's constantly stated his surprise that they are popular overseas, stating in Otakon 2001 that, honestly speaking, I'm very happy that Americans like my work, but Fooly Cooly was basically made for the Japanese audiences. So when I hear they are being well received by American audiences, I feel very happy, but at the same time, I feel a little awkward. Aki Dearest goes into depth about how Adult Swim's experimental release and its compatibility with its other original programming helped propel its status in the West. And Cartoon Cypher, in the same video I mentioned earlier, goes in depth about how some culture-specific gags not related to anime were changed and localized to better suit an American palate. And of course, growing up in fear of adulthood are pretty much universal motifs that are understood everywhere on the planet. But I believe that if we look even further under the hood, some of the story devices have such deep-seated roots in Japanese media creation that I believe are rarely discussed in the Western sphere beyond the usual what the fuck Japan randomness. Let's take a look at two in particular, both of which, if you're fans of this channel, you might already be familiar with. People tend to overstate how crazy and incomprehensible Fooly Cooly actually is, to the point that some like Okada have made claims in the past that
the problem with trying to explain the plot of FLCL is that it is very hard to do so. Mainly because some people would argue that it doesn't even have one.
Granted, this video is quite old and might not reflect his current position, but it was and remains a popularly regurgitated take. Just because what is happening contains some very strange things, doesn't mean it is without plot or story or intent. And I would argue that it is in fact very finely structured, just maybe not in a way you're familiar with. Tsurumaki stated that the intention was to feel like a Japanese advertisement or music video, short but densely packed. And in doing so, in a roundabout way, it accidentally ends up following a very traditional anime story structure. Kishoutenketsu. If you're unfamiliar with Kishoutenketsu, I recommend checking out my video here. But as a quick rundown of it, it is a 4-act story structure originating from East Asian 4-line poetry, specifically Chinese poetry, and comprises of these 4 acts: introduction, development, twist, resolution. And it forms the backbone of basically 90% of all Japanese media. Fooly Cooly may scoff in the face of other anime traditions, but this is one that it follows to the T. Let's try to summarize this seemingly unsummarizable or non-existent narrative. Naota is living his dull, normal life where nothing ever happens when he has a chance encounter with a crazy space alien cop Haruko, who through a series of wacky shenanigans tries to use him as a portal to pull various things from his head, including a robot that he seemingly pilots. We learn more about Naota and his family situation and his worldview. We learn about the 2 most prominent women in his life and their own individual struggles as more and more strange things emerge. A shadow organization monitoring the situation approaches Naota and warns him of Haruko's ulterior motives. and he is revealed to have merely been a puppet, not pilot, and Haruko is definitely up to something. After running away with Haruko, everything comes to head as Haruko tries to use him to release Atmosk, a being of immense power and her true goal. And after finally making a choice for himself that results in Atmosk's escape, Haruko leaves, and Naota is forced to move on. To really drive home how fundamental this structure is, let's go further and break down the first episode into Kishoutenketsu. Naota and Mamimi are living their iffy daily life when Haruko crashes into Naota, whacks him over the head with her base, and generally does a bunch of crazy shit. We're introduced to Naoto's family as Haruko unceremoniously moves in and continues her shenanigans. We learn about his older brother and his relationships with him and Mamimi respectively, and we start to see some of the effects of what Haruko did to him. Naoto's brother is revealed to have a girlfriend, breaking Mamimi mentally and setting off Naota's head portal thing, releasing Kanti and a robot arm who proceed to have a wonton battle. Haruko arrives and incapacitates Kanti, who then becomes a fixture of the household, and Naota and Mamimi recover and share a moment parallel to the beginning. The fact that each episode is structured this way is significant, because in Japan, each episode was released on standalone discs 2 months apart over the course of a year. Part of the initial excitement for Anglo audiences was the fact that something this crazy was airing on television. But the only reason Furikuri exists in the first place was because it wasn't produced for Japanese television. Both in terms of the content itself, as in not having to deal with standards and practices, but also in the art and animation production. The American airing on Adult Swim, where it was in constant rotation, meant that missing an episode, or just not even straight up liking one, wasn't that much of a big deal. In Japan, however, if each episode hadn't have held up on its own, and with a hefty price tag for only 25 minutes of entertainment, and a 2-month wait for the next installment, meant that there would have been very little incentive to buy and wait for all of the releases if each episode wasn't up to snuff. The familiar and easily digestible backbone of this structure allows for the chaos and strangeness to unfold at the breakneck speed that it does. To a Japanese audience. To a Western one, where this structure is nowhere near internalized, especially 20 years ago, these pacing choices on top of the zany content could have very well felt like having almost no plot, and really just make it seem like nothing but pure randomness. The "what the fuck Japan, whoa, so crazy, pure energy, oh my god, couldn't be this in Japan" take has always baffled me, considering the sheer number of quiet, introspective scenes, expertly crafted and structured amongst all the turbulence. The line spoken by Naota in both the first and last episode of the series is interesting. It's definitely ironic and paints Naota as an unreliable narrator, because I mean, of course, look at all this interesting stuff happening. Furikuri is often read as a coming-of-age story, to the point now it's often a cliche to see in reviews and critique of it, something along the lines of, "Oh, that makes sense in the beginning, but after you watch it a few times, you really understand it's about growing up." Naota's repeated line is seen as a reflection of his immaturity in always trying to be mature. As the cartoon Cypher succinctly puts it,
he wants things to remain simple and familiar in a world he doesn't understand, one where nothing really happens and everything is ordinary.
All this crazy stuff happens, but he continues to reject it, because, in the words of Hiding in Public,
Naota chooses to ignore and only see what he wants to see.
But, at the end of the first episode, what has really changed about his life? He still goes to school, still dislikes spicy drinks, still hangs out with the same 3 weirdos. There may be a weird robot with a TV for a head doing housework and a crazy hot space alien babe living in his house, but he still finds his father embarrassing, his absent brother is still living abroad in America. This all brings forward another term that I've talked about quite a bit before, the endless everyday. Coined by Japanese sociologist Miedai Shinji, the term refers to the sense of dull permanence, the plateau in which people in sufficiently developed countries, without any needs to meet or obstacles to face, feel directionless. He notes that this is particularly seen amongst young people, adding that this boredom turns into a suffocating feeling of entrapment, and dreams of the downfall of society act as an outlet for these emotions. This is reflected in the proliferation of apocalyptic imagery throughout bubble-era anime, especially the destruction of cities through Akira-ass explosions, which continued into the 90s and is present within FLCL. Violence is both exaggerated and routine in FLCL. Adults react with babbling insanity only to their direct property damage, while the children can only watch on in mild fascination. Cunty emerging from Naota's head is most commonly read as a puberty metaphor because lol boner. But it can also be interpreted as the desire for the downfall. A being of immense power and change literally emerges from his head to solve all the problems in his life through violence. Slapstick violence, but violence nonetheless. Despite all his Tsuntsun Tsukomi shtick with Haruko, he falls for her, not in spite of her selfish violence, but because of it and what it represents for his life. He has to deal with his stupid father and his absent brother and his immature friends and girls who he doesn't understand or know how to communicate with, and middle school is coming up and wouldn't it be all better if it was just blown away by something? Or better yet, someone. Even at the end of the series, with the two most prominent women in his life leaving him never to be seen again, not much has really changed for Naota. He still goes to school, still dislikes spicy drinks, still hangs out with the same three weirdos. The alien is gone, but the robot remains, having been absorbed into the routine. The climax even gives him the chance to abandon this life and lead one of crazy space adventures with a crazy hot space alien babe. And he rejects it, returning to the comfort of the everyday. Wiser perhaps, and only after nearly destroying it, but he returns nonetheless. People may have come and gone, relationships started and broken, towns literally leveled, but the everyday still remains, because it's always been there. Right? The purpose of this video is not to say that FLCL can only be enjoyed through a Japanese lens. It is undeniably a unique piece of media that crosses cultural borders and resonates with a whole generation of young people, myself included. And for all my posturing, most of my sources still come from English works either written or translated by Westerners. Rather, this video was just meant to highlight some of the ways that all stories can have ties to their cultural thematics, and that the Japanese essence of the series needs to be considered beyond the usual derisive, what the fuck Japan, randomness. Jeff of Mother's Basement brought up an interview with Tsurumaki where he stated that, comparing something like with FLCL, I wanted to say that it is okay to feel stupid, which Jeff relates to the overall message about adulthood and Naota's character growth. But he goes even further to suggest that
it's just not meant to be picked apart frame by frame and understood on every level.
While I can understand the sentiment, it bothers me. One, because I don't think that's exactly what Tsurumaki meant, and two, not meant to be doesn't mean forbidden to. To put it in the words of author Brian Ruh, although my interpretation of FLCL is not what the director states he had in mind when he created the series, the nature of the text, as a postmodern work, allows various strands of meaning to be threaded, which does not confine meaning to one narrow frame, even to that of the work's creator. Walter Benjamin once said, "All human knowledge takes the form of interpretation." A cringy young man in 2013 might have looked at this wacky, interesting Japanese series and tried to impress people by saying it was a Bildungsroman, a word which he had just learnt the week prior in his Western media theory undergraduate degree. But really, who can say whether he was right or wrong?
Me. I can say. This is me. I was wrong.
The thing I like the most about FLCL is that it presents an equal number of knowns and unknowns. For all the WTF even happens-ness of the medical mechanicas and the aliens and the NO field and this fucking thing, there are some motifs that everyone, regardless of origin, just seems to get. Coming of age, making your own path, allowing yourself to feel and make mistakes, the forging and breaking of relationships. They may not have fancy terms to put on it, but they get it, nonetheless. And what they get is all equally valid, as is Brian Ruh's take, as is Jeff's take, and of course, as is Tsurumaki's own. As Captain Christian puts it,
FLCL was a show that I never understood when I was younger, but I felt like it was one of the few things that understood me and what I was going through in that period of my life.
Tsurumaki once described FLCL as imagination being made physical and tangible. At the time, he was talking about his own, But over 20 years later, who's to say whose imagination it